Sometimes the people who change your life arrive carrying nothing more than an umbrella and a quiet smile. The rain began without warning, turning the streets of the small Oregon town into shimmering ribbons of silver as shop owners hurried to pull awnings over their storefronts. Most people rushed toward their cars, hoping to escape the sudden storm before it grew stronger. Clare Bennett, the 38-year-old chief executive officer of Bennett Living Group, stepped out of her luxury SUV wearing an elegant navy business suit, only to realize that she had left her umbrella in her downtown office nearly 50 miles away. She glanced across the quiet street, searching for shelter, and noticed a warm, amber light glowing through the windows of a small woodworking shop. Above the old wooden door hung a simple hand-painted sign that read, "Carter Woodcraft." With rain falling harder by the second, she hurried toward the entrance just as the door opened from the inside. Standing there was Daniel Carter, a 41-year-old single father with kind blue eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, a faded denim work, shirt dusted lightly with sawdust, and calm hands shaped by years of honest craftsmanship. Without asking who she was or why she had come, he simply smiled and stepped aside. "You are welcome to wait until the rain slows down," he said gently. Claire hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The rich scent of fresh cedar and walnut instantly replaced the smell of wet pavement outside. Wooden tables, handcrafted rocking chairs, bookshelves, and carefully carved toys filled the workshop, each piece reflecting patience instead of speed. Soft instrumental music played quietly from an old radio resting on a nearby shelf while rain tapped rhythmically against the windows. Before Claire could thank him, a cheerful voice echoed from the back room. "Dad, I finished my homework." A little girl with long blonde hair and bright, curious eyes appeared carrying a notebook almost as large as her backpack. Daniel smiled warmly. "Emma, we have a guest escaping the ring." Emma immediately offered Claire a clean towel with the effortless kindness children sometimes show better than adults. "You can dry your hands," she said with a bright smile. Claire accepted the towel, surprised by the girl's natural generosity. "Thank you." Emma looked toward the rain outside before asking, "Do you think it will stop soon?" Daniel glanced through the front window and chuckled softly. Storms usually leave as quietly as they arrive. Claire found herself smiling for the first time that entire day. Her calendar had been filled with investor meetings, conference calls, and endless decisions. Yet somehow, this tiny workshop felt calmer than her entire corporate headquarters. She slowly walked through the room, studying handcrafted furniture whose polished surfaces reflected years of experience rather than factory production. Every chair felt unique. Every cabinet carried tiny details that machines could never create. "You build all of these yourself?" she asked. Daniel nodded modestly. "One piece at a time." Claire traced her fingertips lightly across the smooth edge of a walnut dining table. "It is beautiful," Daniel simply replied. "Thank you." There was no sales pitch, no attempt to impress her, only quiet gratitude. Outside, thunder rolled gently across distant hills while the rain continued falling, wrapping the workshop in peaceful silence. Claire suddenly realized she had completely forgotten about her phone, which had not stopped buzzing all morning. For the first time in months, she ignored every notification. She watched Daniel help Emma organize wooden puzzle pieces at a nearby workbench. Noticing how naturally they laughed together over something too small for anyone else to consider important, she had entered the shop, searching only for shelter from a passing storm. Yet without realizing it, she had already stepped into a place where something far more meaningful was quietly waiting to begin. The rain finally softened into a gentle mist, leaving tiny droplets clinging to the workshop windows like scattered crystals. Clare Bennett thanked Daniel Carter for his hospitality before stepping outside, but she paused halfway to her vehicle and looked back through the glass. Inside the warm shop, Daniel had already returned to his workbench, while Emma proudly held a small wooden birdhouse they had been building together. Neither of them noticed Claire watching, yet the quiet scene remained with her all the way back to the city. The following morning began long before sunrise for Daniel. Soft golden light crept across the modest kitchen as fresh coffee brewed and the smell of homemade pancakes filled the air. Emma walked downstairs carrying a school project she had finished the night before, smiling proudly as she placed it on the table. Daniel examined every drawing with genuine interest before giving her an encouraging smile. "You worked hard on this." Emma nodded happily. "I wanted it to be my best," Daniel replied. "When you give your best, that is always enough." After breakfast, they washed the dishes together, laughing when soap bubbles floated across the kitchen. Their home was simple, filled with handmade furniture, family photographs, and shelves holding books instead of expensive decorations. Every chair, every table, and every picture frame had been crafted by Daniel's own hands, quietly turning ordinary rooms into places filled with warmth. Soon afterward, he drove Emma to her elementary school in his older pickup truck. As she climbed out with her backpack, she waved enthusiastically. "Have a good day, Dad." Daniel smiled. "You too, sweetheart. Keep being kind." After watching her disappear safely through the school entrance, he returned to Carter Woodcraft, unlocking the front door just as the morning sun reached the storefront. Inside the workshop, he carefully sanded the surface of a walnut dining table while local customers stopped by to collect handcrafted furniture or simply enjoy conversation. Daniel greeted every visitor with the same patience and respect, never rushing anyone, even when work waited on every bench. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire entered the towering headquarters of Bennett Living Group, where elevators opened onto polished marble floors and assistants hurried between conference rooms carrying contracts and presentation folders. Meetings filled every hour of her schedule. Yet her thoughts unexpectedly drifted back to the quiet woodworking shop. During a discussion about furnishing a new community development, one executive suggested purchasing inexpensive factory furniture in bulk. Claire remained silent for a moment before asking, "Has anyone considered working with local craftsmen instead?" Several executives exchanged surprised glances. That afternoon, instead of returning directly to another meeting, Claire quietly drove back toward the small town. She parked outside Carter Woodcraft and stepped inside once again. The familiar scent of cedar welcomed her before Daniel looked up from his workbench with the same calm smile he had worn the previous day. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "The weather is much friendlier today." Claire smiled in return. "I actually came because I would like to order a dining table." Daniel nodded. "Tell me about the home where it will live." The question caught Claire completely off guard. Every designer she had ever hired asked about dimensions, finishes, or budgets. No one had ever asked about the people who would gather around the table. For several quiet seconds, she found herself searching for an answer that reached far beyond measurements. While Daniel simply waited with patient kindness, unaware that one simple question had gently opened a door inside Claire's heart that had remained closed for many years. Claire lowered her hand from the polished walnut tabletop and quietly exhaled, realizing she had never truly thought about what a home was meant to feel like. Daniel did not interrupt the silence. He simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that the most honest answers could never be rushed. Finally, Claire smiled softly. "I suppose I have spent so much time building offices that I forgot how to build a dining room." Daniel nodded gently. "A dining table is where people remember birthdays, celebrate good news, forgive mistakes, and stay together a little longer before saying goodnight. I always like to know whose memories I'm helping to build." His words settled into Claire's heart with surprising weight. She looked around the workshop once again and noticed framed photographs hanging along one wall. Families of every age smiled beside handcrafted furniture that Daniel had created over the years. Some photographs showed children drawing on wooden tables while grandparents laughed beside them. None of the pictures looked staged. Every smile appeared genuine. Emma walked in carrying a tray with 3 mugs of fresh hot chocolate. "Dad says, every important conversation deserves something warm to drink," she said cheerfully as she handed one mug to Claire. Claire accepted it with an appreciative smile. "Thank you, Emma." The little girl climbed onto a nearby stool and continued coloring a picture while Daniel carefully sketched several possible table designs onto a large sheet of paper. "How many people usually gather for dinner?" he asked. Claire looked down at the steaming mug before answering honestly. "Usually just me." Daniel quietly nodded without offering sympathy or surprise. "Then perhaps we should build a table that leaves room for more chairs someday." Claire looked at him, unsure whether he was talking about furniture or life itself. Before she could respond, her phone began vibrating again with another series of business calls. She glanced at the screen, then slowly pressed the silent button and placed the phone face down on the workbench. For the first time in years, the conversation in front of her mattered more than the meetings waiting elsewhere. Over the following weeks, Claire found reasons to visit Carter Woodcraft more often. Sometimes she reviewed with samples for the dining table. Other times she simply stopped by on her drive home with fresh pastries from a nearby bakery. Emma always greeted her with the same bright enthusiasm, eagerly sharing school projects, science experiments, or stories about the neighborhood library. Daniel welcomed Claire exactly as he welcomed every customer, never treating her differently because of her position or success. One crisp Saturday morning, he invited Claire to see the first stage of the table's construction. Together, they stood beside thick walnut boards resting across sturdy work supports while sunlight streamed through the workshop windows. Daniel carefully explained how each board had grown differently with unique grain patterns and natural imperfections. "If I force every piece to become identical," he said, while gently running his hand across the wood, "the table loses its character. The strongest pieces come from respecting what makes each board different." Claire listened quietly, realizing the lesson reached far beyond woodworking. She had spent years expecting employees, executives, and even herself to fit perfect plans that rarely allowed room for humanity. Emma suddenly held up another drawing she had finished that morning. It showed the workshop beneath a bright blue sky with 3 smiling figures standing outside together. Claire studied the picture, noticing that Emma had naturally included her beside Daniel without hesitation or explanation. Something inside her warmed in a way that no promotion, award, or business achievement had ever accomplished. And as afternoon sunlight filled the little workshop with golden light, none of them realized that a friendship built one ordinary conversation at a time was already becoming the strongest foundation any family could ever hope to share. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the small Oregon town with shades of gold, amber, and deep crimson as cool morning air carried the comforting scent of fallen leaves through the open doors of Carter Woodcraft. Clare Bennett found herself visiting the workshop almost every week. Although the walnut dining table had long since entered its final stages of construction, she always told herself she was stopping by to check the progress. Yet each visit lasted longer than the one before because conversations with Daniel Carter somehow made time slow down. One Thursday afternoon, she entered the workshop looking noticeably more tired than usual. Her normally perfect posture seemed weighed down by something invisible, and the smile she offered was smaller than before. Daniel immediately noticed the difference, but did not ask what was wrong. Instead, he simply poured 2 cups of fresh coffee and placed one beside her without saying a word. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm mug and stared quietly through the front window where gentle rain had begun falling once again. After several peaceful minutes, she finally spoke. "Have you ever felt like no matter how much you accomplish, it is never enough?" Daniel leaned back against his workbench before answering softly. "More than once." Claire looked surprised. "Really?" He smiled gently. "After my wife passed away, I kept believing that if I worked harder, earned more money, or built more furniture, somehow everything would feel normal again. It never worked." Claire remained silent, listening carefully. Daniel continued sanding a wooden chair as he spoke. "Eventually, I realized Emma never needed a perfect father. She only needed one who came home every evening." His words settled into the quiet workshop more deeply than any advice Claire had ever received from consultants or leadership coaches. She slowly lowered her eyes toward the wooden floor. "Everyone expects me to have answers," she admitted. "Employees, investors, board members, clients. Some days I wonder if anyone actually sees the person behind the job title." Daniel nodded with understanding instead of sympathy. "Sometimes people only see what you carry, not what you carry inside." The gentle sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the silence that followed. Emma walked in carrying a small tray of freshly baked oatmeal cookies she had made with a neighbor earlier that afternoon. Without asking any questions, she placed one cookie beside Claire's coffee. "These always make rainy days better," she said with an innocent smile before returning to finish reading her library book in the corner of the workshop. Claire laughed quietly for the first time all day. "She has remarkable timing." Daniel smiled proudly. "She usually does." The conversation drifted towards simple things after that. They talked about favorite childhood books, local hiking trails, homemade soup recipes, and the changing colors of the maple trees lining the streets outside. For nearly an hour, Claire forgot about quarterly reports, shareholder expectations, and endless conference calls. She simply enjoyed being present. As evening approached, her phone rang once again. The caller identification displayed the chairman of her board. Claire looked at the screen for several seconds before politely declining the call. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He understood that some decisions were deeply personal and did not need witnesses. When Claire finally stood to leave, she looked around the warm workshop before quietly saying, "This is the only place where nobody expects me to be impressive." Daniel smiled with quiet kindness. "Maybe because you never needed to be." Claire stood perfectly still, unexpectedly moved by such simple words. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets washed clean beneath the sky, glowing with soft evening light. As she walked toward her vehicle, she realized she had arrived carrying the weight of an entire company, but was leaving with a lighter heart than she had felt in years. Never imagining that the quiet peace she kept finding inside one small woodworking shop would soon begin changing every priority she believed her life depended upon. A week later, the finished walnut dining table stood proudly in the center of Carter Woodcraft, its smooth surface glowing beneath the warm afternoon sunlight that streamed through the workshop windows. Every edge had been carefully shaped by Daniel Carter's steady hands, every grain preserved rather than hidden, every detail reflecting weeks of quiet dedication. Clare Bennett slowly walked around the table, gently resting her fingertips against the polished wood before smiling with genuine admiration. "It is even more beautiful than I imagined," she whispered. Daniel simply replied, "I am glad it feels right." Emma hurried into the room carrying a large envelope decorated with colorful pencil drawings. "I made something before you take the table home," she announced excitedly. Claire accepted the envelope with a curious smile and carefully opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn picture showing a large dining table surrounded by 3 smiling people sharing dinner together while sunlight poured through nearby windows. At the top, written in careful elementary school handwriting, were the words, "A table is happiest when nobody eats alone." Claire stared at the drawing without speaking. Her eyes slowly filled with emotion as she realized Emma had once again included her. Beside Daniel without hesitation, as though she naturally belonged there. She looked toward Emma and asked softly, "Why did you draw me?" Emma answered with complete innocence, "Because every time you visit, Dad smiles more and our workshop feels happier." Daniel looked slightly embarrassed and quietly rubbed the back of his neck. "Emma has a wonderful imagination." Emma shook her head. "It is not imagination." The room fell peacefully silent. Claire carefully folded the drawing before placing it back inside the envelope as though it were something precious. Later that afternoon, the 3 of them loaded the dining table into Daniel's delivery truck and drove toward Claire's home on the edge of the city. Her modern house overlooked rolling hills and impressive landscaping. Yet, despite its beauty, it felt unusually quiet. Large open rooms echoed with silence, and the elegant dining room contained nothing except empty space waiting for the table. Daniel and Clare carefully positioned the handcrafted piece beneath a wide window overlooking the backyard. As sunlight settled across the rich walnut surface, the entire room seemed warmer than before. Emma stepped back and smiled proudly. "Now it finally looks like people belong here." Clare quietly laughed. "I think you might be right." After everything was in place, Daniel prepared to leave, but Clare hesitated before speaking. "Would both of you stay for dinner?" Daniel looked surprised. "We would not want to interrupt your evening." Clare gently shook her head. "You would be making my evening." Emma looked hopefully toward her father. Daniel smiled and nodded. Together they prepared a simple meal in Clare's spacious kitchen. There were no private chefs, no formal place settings, and no business conversations. They chopped vegetables, stirred soup, sliced fresh bread, and laughed when Emma accidentally sprinkled too much parsley into the salad. As they finally gathered around the new walnut table, Clare looked at the empty chairs surrounding them before quietly saying, "This room has always been beautiful, but tonight it finally feels alive." Daniel smiled warmly without replying because some moments needed only gratitude, not explanation. Emma reached across the table and placed her little hand gently over Clare's. "See," she said with the quiet certainty only a child could possess. "Tables really are happiest when nobody eats alone." Clare felt something inside her heart begin to heal, and although none of them spoke another word about it that evening, every shared laugh, every passing dish, and every simple conversation quietly became the beginning of memories that would one day make all three of them realize they had stopped living like visitors in one another's lives and had quietly started becoming something much more enduring. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm that none of them had planned, yet all of them gradually treasured. Every Saturday morning, Clare Bennett drove away from the fast pace of the city and toward Carter Woodcraft, where the scent of fresh cedar greeted her before she even opened the workshop door. Emma always ran to welcome her with another story from school, another library book she wanted to recommend, or another small craft project she had proudly finished. Daniel Carter never made a ceremony of Clare's visits. He simply smiled, poured a cup of coffee, and continued shaping wood while conversations flowed as naturally as sunlight through the old workshop windows. Winter slowly approached, bringing crisp air and shorter afternoons. One weekend, the three of them visited the annual Community Harvest Festival held in the town square. Local musicians played familiar songs while children laughed around handmade carnival games and neighbors greeted one another by name. Daniel helped Emma build a small bird feeder at one of the craft booths while Clare watched with quiet admiration. She had attended countless charity galas and executive receptions over the years. Yet none of them had ever felt as genuine as watching a father patiently teach his daughter how to tighten a simple wooden screw. Later, they shared hot apple cider while walking beneath rows of maple trees glowing in shades of gold and scarlet. Emma suddenly reached for Clare's hand without hesitation as they crossed the street. Clare instinctively held it, surprised by how natural the moment felt. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Some gifts became more meaningful when left unspoken. As evening arrived, they returned to the workshop where Daniel prepared to close for the day. Clare remained seated near the fireplace, quietly watching the flames dance across the polished wooden floor. After several peaceful minutes, she asked a question she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "Why did you stay here?" Daniel looked up from placing tools back into their cabinet. "You could have expanded your business, opened stores across the state, and earned much more." He smiled gently before answering. "People asked me that many times." Clare waited patiently. Daniel looked toward a framed photograph resting above the fireplace. It showed him beside his late wife, both smiling while holding a newborn, Emma. "After my wife passed away, several companies offered partnerships in larger cities. The opportunities were generous, but they would have taken me away from home almost every week." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Emma had already lost one parent. I could not let her lose the other to ambition. Claire lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the quiet certainty in his voice. Daniel continued calmly. Children remember who showed up. They rarely remember who became famous. Those simple words echoed through the room long after he finished speaking. Claire suddenly thought about the countless birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings she had postponed because another meeting always seemed more important. Success had filled her calendar, but had quietly emptied her evenings. Emma walked over carrying a small scrapbook she had been assembling throughout the fall. She placed it in Claire's lap with a bright smile. Inside were photographs from the workshop, the community festival, shared dinners, and afternoons spent laughing over simple projects. Every page included handwritten captions, but one sentence stood out above all the others. The best families are built one ordinary day at a time. Claire felt tears gently gather in her eyes as she looked from the scrapbook to Daniel and then to Emma. No one reached for grand speeches or dramatic promises. They simply sat together beside the warm fire while snowflakes began drifting silently beyond the workshop windows. And for the first time in many years, Claire understood that the richest investment she would ever make had nothing to do with companies, buildings, or balance sheets, but with the quiet people who had slowly transformed an ordinary woodworking shop into the place her heart was beginning to recognize as home. Snow covered the rooftops of the little town as December quietly settled across the valley, wrapping familiar streets in peaceful silence and turning Carter Woodcraft into an even warmer refuge from the cold. The workshop windows glowed softly each evening, while handcrafted lamps illuminated shelves filled with finished furniture, waiting for holiday deliveries. Clare Bennett had gradually changed her routine without even realizing it. Instead of spending every weekend reviewing financial reports inside her downtown penthouse, she now found herself driving toward Daniel Carter's workshop with homemade soup, fresh bread from a neighborhood bakery, or simply another reason to spend a few quiet hours with him and Emma. The remarkable part was that she no longer searched for excuses. She simply wanted to be there. One Saturday morning, the three of them decorated a modest evergreen tree standing beside the workshop fireplace. Emma carefully hung handmade wooden ornaments that Daniel had carved over many years, each one representing a Christmas memory they had shared together since she was a little girl. Claire paused while holding one unfinished ornament shaped like a small house. "This one is beautiful," she said softly. Emma smiled. Dad never finished it. Daniel looked up from untangling a string of lights. I was waiting until it felt complete. Claire gently turned the little wooden house in her hands. Maybe some things take time because they are worth waiting for. Daniel met her eyes for a quiet moment before smiling, understanding there was far more inside those words than either of them felt ready to explain. Later that afternoon, they carried boxes of handcrafted toys and wooden puzzles to the town community center, where local volunteers organized a holiday celebration for families facing financial hardship. Daniel quietly repaired several broken shelves inside the building before anyone even asked for help. Claire spent the afternoon serving warm meals alongside Emma, who happily handed small gift bags to excited children. No reporters attended the event. No photographers documented their kindness. There were no speeches, awards, or recognition. It was simply three people choosing to spend their day making someone else's Christmas a little brighter. As evening approached, snow began falling again while families slowly returned home carrying gifts and grateful smiles. Emma looked around the nearly empty hall before quietly asking, "Can we always do this together every year?" Daniel answered first. "I would like that." Claire looked toward both of them before smiling with complete sincerity. "So would I." On the drive back to town, gentle snowflakes drifted across the windshield while Christmas lights shimmered from houses lining the streets. Emma had fallen asleep in the back seat, wrapped comfortably beneath a warm blanket. Daniel carefully parked outside Claire's home so they would not wake her immediately. For several peaceful minutes, neither adult spoke. Finally, Claire broke the silence. I used to think success meant building the biggest company in the room. Daniel listened quietly. Now? He asked. Claire looked through the window toward Emma, sleeping peacefully behind them. Now I think success is becoming the kind of person a child naturally feels safe beside. Daniel smiled gently, his voice almost no louder than the falling snow. That is a goal worth protecting. Claire slowly reached into her purse and removed the small drawing Emma had given her weeks earlier of 3 people gathered around a dining table. She had carried it with her every day since receiving it. The paper had softened from being folded and unfolded countless times. Yet, the drawing still made her smile exactly as it had the first day. Looking at it beneath the glow of the streetlights, Claire quietly realized she no longer felt like a visitor in Daniel's life or a guest. Inside Emma's world, without anyone announcing it, without promises or dramatic declarations, 3 lonely hearts had slowly learned to trust one another so completely that what had once felt like friendship was quietly becoming something that neither time nor distance would ever be able to separate. The first warm days of spring slowly melted the last traces of winter, filling the little town with blooming cherry trees and fresh green hills that stretched beyond Carter Woodcraft. Life seemed to breathe a little easier, and so did Clare Bennett. Her weekends were no longer reserved for endless business reports or late-night conference calls. Instead, they had become filled with ordinary moments that quietly transformed into treasured memories. She helped Daniel Carter plant flowers outside the workshop, laughed with Emma while painting small wooden birdhouses, and discovered that happiness often arrived disguised as simple routines shared with people who genuinely cared about one another. One bright Saturday afternoon, they gathered in the backyard behind the workshop, where Daniel was finishing a handcrafted porch swing beneath the shade of a large maple tree. Emma carefully brushed the final coat of finish across the smooth wood before stepping back proudly. "Now everybody can sit together," she said with a satisfied smile. Daniel admired her work before nodding. "You have become a wonderful helper." Emma grinned. "Only because you both taught me." Claire smiled warmly, touched by how naturally Emma now included her in every sentence about family. As they carried the completed swing toward the front porch, they paused to admire the peaceful view of the quiet neighborhood. Birds sang from nearby branches while a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the air. Claire looked toward Daniel and softly asked the question that had quietly lived inside her heart for many months. "If home is not really a place," she said, "could it simply be the people who make you feel safe?" Daniel rested one hand on the porch railing before answering with his familiar palm. "I think home is where you no longer feel the need to pretend." Claire lowered her eyes thoughtfully. She realized that inside boardrooms she constantly measured every word, every decision, and every expression. Yet inside this little woodworking shop, she had never once worried about being impressive. She had only been herself. Emma walked between them carrying 3 glasses of fresh lemonade before noticing the thoughtful silence. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Claire smiled and looked at the little girl. "We were trying to decide what home really means." Emma answered almost immediately. "That is easy." Daniel laughed softly. "Is it?" Emma nodded confidently. "Home is wherever the people you love are waiting for you?" Neither adult spoke. The child's simple answer somehow carried more wisdom than all the leadership seminars Claire had attended throughout her career. Later that evening, they shared dinner once again around the walnut table that had quietly become the center of so many meaningful conversations. After the meal, Emma disappeared into the living room before returning with another drawing. This time it showed a small white house surrounded by flowers with Daniel, Claire, and herself, standing together on the front porch beneath a bright blue sky. Above them, she had written one short sentence in careful handwriting. "Families grow with love, not with time." Claire carefully held the picture against her heart before looking toward Daniel. Their eyes met for a quiet moment filled with complete understanding. No promises needed to be spoken because every shared day had already become a promise in itself. As the evening sunlight slowly filled the room with golden light, Claire realized she no longer measured her future by quarterly goals or corporate expansion plans. Instead, she quietly found herself imagining birthday dinners, school graduations, holiday mornings, and ordinary evenings spent around one handmade table, where laughter had become more valuable than success. And without anyone announcing it aloud, the future that once seemed impossible had begun to feel beautifully, peacefully, and completely within reach. Several years passed with the quiet certainty of changing seasons, and the little woodworking shop remained exactly where it had always stood, its warm lights welcoming neighbors long before sunrise and glowing softly each evening after the streets had grown still. Some things had changed, however, in the most beautiful ways. The walnut dining table that Daniel Carter had once crafted by hand had become the heart of a home filled with laughter instead of silence. Family photographs now covered the nearby walls, capturing birthdays, school plays, community festivals, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and countless ordinary evenings that had quietly become life's greatest treasures. Emma was now a confident young teenager whose kindness reflected both the gentle strength of her father and the compassionate heart of Clare Bennett. She often spent afternoons in the workshop learning woodworking from Daniel before helping Clare organize local community projects that supported small family businesses and neighborhood schools. Clare had also changed in ways that surprised even herself. Although she remained the respected chief executive officer of Bennett Living Group, she no longer measured success only through financial reports or expanding markets. She had introduced new company policies encouraging employees to spend meaningful time with their families, supported local craftsmen throughout the region, and quietly funded scholarships for vocational education without ever asking for public recognition. One sunny Saturday afternoon, the town celebrated the grand opening of a new community learning center built through a partnership between local artisans and Clare's company. Children explored reading rooms filled with handcrafted bookshelves, while families gathered beneath large maple trees outside. Daniel had personally designed every wooden bench inside the building, believing that places of learning should feel as welcoming as home. During the ceremony, the mayor invited Daniel and Clare to stand together for a photograph recognizing their contributions. As the crowd applauded, Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but Clare simply smiled because she understood him better than anyone else. After the event, the three of them walked slowly back toward Carter Woodcraft beneath the sky, painted with the soft colors of early evening. Emma carried an old scrapbook that had grown much thicker over the years. She stopped outside the workshop and opened to the very first page where the drawing of three people around a dining table remained carefully preserved. Looking up with bright, grateful eyes, she smiled and said, "Do you remember when I drew this?" Clare laughed softly. "I have never forgotten." Daniel gently placed one arm around Emma's shoulders before looking toward Clare. "Neither have I." Emma closed the scrapbook and quietly slipped her hand into Clare's. "I think I finally understand something," she said. "Families are not always the people who are there at the beginning. Sometimes they are the people who choose to stay." For a long moment, no one spoke. There was nothing left to explain because every shared meal, every rainy afternoon, every holiday, every ordinary conversation, and every quiet act of kindness had already written the answer across their lives. The evening breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar from the workshop, while golden sunlight settled gently across the porch, where the handmade swing still rested beneath the old maple tree. Daniel looked toward the home that had once felt incomplete, then toward the two people standing beside him, and smiled with peaceful gratitude. Clare realized that the greatest decision of her life had not been made inside a boardroom or signed on an important contract. It had begun the day she stepped through the door of a small woodworking shop simply to escape the rain. Sometimes family is not found by searching. Sometimes it quietly walks into your life, stays through every season, and teaches your heart that love grows strongest where kindness lives, where trust grows one ordinary day at a time, and where strangers slowly become the people you can never imagine living without.